The cabin wasn't just a wooden structure standing between trees. It was my escape, my peace, my breathing space away from the constant noise of city life. Jablog kadi hain ka mountains ka pasrena surf cup surti hodi hai. Wa galat nahi hote. Lekin wa yebi nahi samajte ka wahan ka sukoon or dimak ko kitna halka karda hai. Every time I drove up that winding road, the air felt fresher, the world felt quieter, and life finally slowed down enough for my thoughts to catch up with me. I had worked hard for this place. Every inch of it was legally mine, earned with patience and responsibility, and I respected it dearly. I wasn't part of any community drama. I minded my own business. I paid my taxes, maintained my land, and never interfered in anyone else's life. For years, everything stayed perfect. Then one day, the HOA leadership changed, and everything turned upside down. The new HOA president walked like he owned the mountains, talked like he was some king, and acted like everyone around him lived under his command. The first time he confronted me, he didn't come with respect, friendliness, ya basic decency. Instead, he came like a judge delivering a sentence. He stood at my gate and informed me coldly that my cabin did not align with neighborhood standards, and therefore I must comply with HOA regulations immediately. I looked at him calmly and said one line that absolutely crushed his ego. "I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority over me. Walain you say idni buri lagi kuas kachera rang badal gaya." Instead of backing off, he doubled down. Slowly, harassment started. HOA members began slowing their cars outside my gate, taking pictures, whispering like detectives analyzing a crime scene. Notices appeared taped to my fence demanding approval for things that didn't concern them. I ignored them because ignorance doesn't deserve energy. Magar HOA wali samajte the ku unki awaz high system high. They thought repeating power would turn into power. But then came that day. The day I arrived at my cabin expecting peace, and instead found rage sitting in front of me in the form of thick metal chains wrapped around my gate. The entrance to my own property locked. A bold, arrogant notice slapped across it reading, "Access sealed, HOA authority." For a moment I simply stared, shocked, then anger slowly burned in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't miscommunication. This was war. But I didn't react emotionally. I didn't break the lock in anger. Instead, I smiled slightly, because I knew something they didn't. Something that would change the entire game. When I stood there staring at that chained gate, it felt like every ounce of respect I had patiently carried for years suddenly evaporated into cold mountain air. It wasn't just a lock. It was a message. A loud, arrogant declaration that they believed their imaginary power was stronger than the law, stronger than ownership, stronger than basic human rights. For a moment, I ran my hand across the cold metal chain, feeling the weight of their ego in every link, and instead of getting furious, I felt strangely calm. Because anger blinds you, but calmness lets you think, and thinking was exactly what they didn't expect me to do. I took out my phone, recorded everything, every angle, every small detail, date, time, notice text, even tire marks leading up to the gate so no one could later claim it wasn't them. For Main Sheriff Ko Kalkia. When the sheriff arrived, the HOA president confidently marched down the road like a general arriving to claim victory. He spoke without breathing, throwing legal-sounding words around like confetti, acting as if this was his world and I was trespassing on it. He waved printed HOA regulations like holy scriptures, pointing at paragraphs that didn't even apply to me. The sheriff listened, nodded, didn't interrupt, and then turned to me quietly and asked if I wanted to press charges for unlawful property interference. Suddenly, the HOA president's bravado cracked. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't loud anymore. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. That's when I realized something powerful. Bullies don't fear strength. They fear consequences. I could have pressed charges right there. I could have dragged him through court, humiliated him publicly, destroyed his reputation overnight. But instead, I chose patience. I said, just document everything. The sheriff cut the lock open, filed the report, and officially recorded the HOA's illegal action. The president tried to argue again, tried to twist words, but the sheriff shut him down cold. explaining that HOA rules do not override property law. That should have been the end of it. That should have humbled them. That should have taught them to back off. But entitlement runs deeper than logic. They didn't just hate losing. They hated not owning me. And as I stood there watching the chaos fade, I glanced toward the road winding down from their community. A quiet strip of asphalt I had driven past 1,000 times without thinking, until that day. Suddenly, a realization struck like thunder in silence. That entire exit road, the one every resident depended on, the one that connected their beautiful gated world to civilization, ran straight across my property. Not theirs, not city land, mine. And unlike their fake authority, this wasn't emotional. This wasn't opinion. This was legally documented truth. Years ago, when the original developers built that community, they never filed a permanent easement. They simply assumed land access would always remain unchallenged. They assumed no one would ever question it. They assumed wrong. I drove home that night with a storm brewing inside me, but not of rage, of clarity. They tried to trap me behind a locked gate, confident they owned control. They had no idea they were standing inside a glass house while throwing stones. So instead of retaliating emotionally, I made my move intelligently. I contacted a professional land surveyor. Days later, standing under the bright mountain sun, legal documents in hand, every line of boundary crystal clear, I confirmed my suspicion. The road was mine. Every inch, every tire mark, every vehicle using it was technically trespassing. The power balance didn't just shift. It flipped completely. The HOA president who believed he controlled my life didn't realize his entire community's freedom relied on land he had just tried to bully. That realization didn't make me angry anymore. It made me smile, because life sometimes has a poetic way of aligning justice. They thought sealing my gate would break me. They didn't know it had only unlocked something far stronger. The next move would be mine. And trust me, it was going to be unforgettable. After confirming that the road was legally mine, a sense of empowerment washed over me like warm sunlight on a frigid morning. It wasn't just about the road. It was about leverage, about turning their arrogance and blind entitlement into an opportunity for calm, calculated justice. I sat at my kitchen table, documents spread before me, and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. They thought they had me trapped, powerless, frustrated, maybe even scared. But all of that was about to change. The first thing I realized was that I needed patience. Reacting in anger, no matter how satisfying in the short term, would only play into their expectations. They wanted chaos. They wanted me to lash out. I didn't give them that satisfaction. I wanted the long game. I wanted a solution so elegant, so undeniable, that even their smug, self-righteous smiles would vanish in one swift moment of truth. I started by documenting everything. I took photographs of every gate seal, every chain, every letter they had sent claiming authority. I noted dates, times, witness statements from neighbors who had seen the actions, and even little quirks, like the scuff marks on the driveway where the HOA truck had parked carelessly. Every detail mattered because when dealing with someone who thrives on intimidation, the small things become ammunition. Then came the planning. I walked the road that crossed my property, imagining every scenario. I thought about what would happen if someone tried to block access again. I imagined the panic on the HOA board's faces when they realized their supposed control over the community was entirely dependent on land they did not own. I envisioned the subtle ways I could assert my rights without confrontation, letting logic and legality do the talking while they fumed helplessly. I also reached out to a few trusted neighbors outside the HOA. They were unaware of the land ownership intricacies, but I gently explained the situation without giving away the full scope of my plan. Some of them laughed, some looked shocked, but all understood one fundamental truth. Power without legality is meaningless. The subtle shift in awareness was already forming a ripple, a quiet momentum building beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the HOA continued their usual antics. They circulated letters about community safety, claiming the sealed gate was necessary for maintenance. They held meetings without me, assuming I wouldn't challenge their narrative. But I knew better. They were walking a tightrope built entirely on assumptions and entitlement. They had no legal foothold, and I had every piece of proof lined up, ready for the moment when patience met opportunity. The tension built silently, like clouds gathering on a calm afternoon. Neighbors whispered, HOA members plotted, and I waited. I waited while continuing my normal life, interacting politely, maintaining the facade of calm, while inside, the plan crystallized. It was simple in theory but devastating in execution. I would assert my property rights at the exact moment their arrogance collided with reality. No shouting, no threats, no unnecessary drama. Just undeniable proof and the slow, inevitable collapse of their perceived control. And then it happened. A minor incident. A truck attempting to make a shortcut through my property, as if testing the boundaries, confirmed everything. The driver stopped, confused, hesitated, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of realization in their eyes. This road wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs. Every vehicle passing through without permission was, technically, trespassing. And now, the invisible lines that had long protected the HOA's sense of superiority were dissolving, revealing vulnerability they never imagined. I smiled quietly, savoring the moment. This wasn't about revenge. It was about principle. It was about showing that power built on arrogance and fear has limits, especially when confronted with strategy, calmness, and undeniable legality. And as I stood there, watching the road, imagining the reactions to come, I knew one thing. The next time the HOA tried to assert control, it wouldn't just fail. It would backfire spectacularly. The beauty of it all was in the anticipation. I didn't need to act immediately. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone yet. The tension itself was a weapon. Each day that passed, each person who drove unknowingly across my land, unknowingly asserting my quiet control, added weight to the inevitable revelation. And when the moment came, it would be more than a lesson. It would be a statement, one so clear and unambiguous that even the most entitled, arrogant members of the HOA could not ignore it. This was the turning point. The gate incident was no longer a mere inconvenience. It was the spark that ignited a strategy, a meticulously planned assertion of rights that would unfold with precision. And in that moment, standing on my land, watching the road wind through the forest, I realized something profound. Patience, preparation, and subtle intelligence are far more powerful than anger, confrontation, or entitlement. The next move would be mine, and when it came, it would be unforgettable. The calm before the storm stretched on for days. I continued my routine, waved politely at neighbors, nodded at passing HOA members, all while keeping my knowledge a secret. Every smile, every nod, every mundane interaction was a part of the plan. Because sometimes true power lies not in immediate action but in the quiet certainty of knowing your position and letting others walk straight into the trap of their own assumptions. And so the stage was set. The HOA believed they had seized control by sealing my gate. They believed they had won. They had no idea that their only exit, their lifeline to the outside world, rested entirely on land they did not own. And soon, very soon, they would learn a lesson that no letter, meeting, or intimidation tactic could ever erase. But patience, as I had learned, was the key. Every day that passed, the tension built, the anticipation grew, and the inevitability of their confrontation became clearer. And as I watched the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across my property, I felt a thrill that was both quiet and profound. This wasn't just about a road or a gate. It was about respect, boundaries, and the undeniable power of calm, strategic thinking. When the next HOA meeting was announced, when their emails and complaints began arriving, when their arrogance grew bolder, I knew the moment was approaching. The setup was complete. The proof was undeniable. And the lesson, when it came, would echo far beyond the boundaries of my property. Because entitlement, when met with strategy and patience, has a way of exposing itself in the most spectacularly satisfying way imaginable. And I was ready. The morning of the confrontation arrived like any other, deceptively calm. Frost clung to the edges of my cabin roof, the air crisp and biting, but inside, My heart carried a quiet excitement. I had spent weeks planning, observing, and waiting, and now the moment had arrived when patience would meet opportunity. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, taking in the familiar sight of the sealed gate. The HOA had done it again overnight, their audacity unwavering, their belief in control as inflated as ever. But this time, they were stepping into a situation they didn't fully understand. They didn't know that the gate and the road beyond it were my leverage. They thought they had power over me. They thought the letters, the seals, and the threats could intimidate someone who had, after all, simply tried to enjoy the peace of their cabin in the woods. They were wrong. I began my morning routine, but with a subtle difference. I watched every car that came near, every member of the HOA who arrived, every curious neighbor peeking from behind curtains became part of the unfolding scene. They didn't know it yet, but they were actors in a story that was about to teach a lesson in patience, preparation, and strategic calm. Around mid-morning, the first HOA representative appeared. A man named Jeff, always brisk, always trying to assert authority, walked up to the gate with a clipboard in hand, muttering about community regulations and safety concerns. I stepped outside casually, smiling. "Morning, Jeff," I said, letting my tone remain neutral, calm. "Nice day, isn't it?" Jeff froze for a split second, probably expecting anger, frustration, or at least tension. Instead, he got a cheerful acknowledgement and a polite smile. That subtle disarming of expectation was the first move of the day. I let him talk, listing rules and regulations, his voice growing increasingly animated, his gestures sharp and precise. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting him exhaust himself. And then came the question I had been waiting for. "Do you understand that you're blocking the community's only exit?" I raised an eyebrow, pretending to consider the statement carefully. "I do," I said slowly, letting each word land. "Which is why I want to make sure we're all on the same page regarding property ownership." I gestured casually toward the road. "Because this road passes entirely over land I legally own. And that means, legally, I control access." Jeff's face shifted from confidence to disbelief in a matter of seconds. He tried to mask it with more talk about rules, safety, and precedent, but the cracks in his composure were visible. This was the moment patience had been building toward, the realization that their supposed authority was based on assumptions, not legality. I continued calmly, "I'm happy to discuss ways to maintain community safety, but the fact remains, my property, my rules. Any action you take without my consent could be considered trespassing. I thought it might be better if we had a rational conversation before anyone makes irreversible mistakes." Jeff's face reddened, his hands gripping the clipboard like it was a lifeline. He muttered something about consulting the board, about formal notices, but I let him speak, nodding politely, never raising my voice. Every word, every gesture, was measured to ensure the legal reality of the situation spoke louder than any emotional argument he could make. Then came the subtle panic. The tension in his shoulders, the tiny shifts in his stance, the rapid blinking. All signs that he was starting to understand the stakes. And I had not even begun to assert the full power of my position. The neighborhood, unbeknownst to him, had started to take notice. From behind windows, from driveways, from the far edge of the forest line, neighbors were watching. Some whispered, others filmed discreetly. The power dynamic was shifting, and the silent witnesses amplified the impact. Jeff had authority on paper, but the court of public perception was no longer on his side. I decided it was time for the next move. "If you want to maintain access safely," I said, letting the words hang in the air, "we can work together. But any attempt to bypass my property without permission, especially after the clear ownership records I've provided, will be documented and addressed legally. I prefer collaboration over conflict." The words hit like a soft but precise hammer. I could see the frustration building behind Jeff's carefully maintained mask. He realized that aggression would not work here, that intimidation would not yield results, and that their assumption of control was unraveling right in front of him. At that moment, another HOA member arrived. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of rules, whose arrogance rivaled her obsession with order, strode up with her usual clipped, perfect movements, sunglasses reflecting the winter sun. She had been watching from a distance, probably thinking she would swoop in and assert dominance. Instead, she was greeted by the same calm, measured reality, my legal ownership. Her smile faltered as I greeted her politely. "Good morning, Karen. I trust you've seen the documents confirming the road's passage over my property." Karen blinked, her smirk disappearing for the first time in weeks. She tried to regain composure with rehearsed lines about community safety and responsibility, but I let her speak, nodding, maintaining calm. She had nothing to counter the facts. Her usual intimidation tactics, sharp words, public shaming, threats, were powerless against documentation and patience. Then came the subtle, devastating punchline. I suggested a compromise. If the community truly needs a safe exit, I'm open to installing a controlled access point on my land, managed collaboratively, ensuring safety for everyone. But it must be mutually agreed upon, legally documented, and respect property boundaries. Karen's eyes widened, realization dawning. She had been so confident, so sure of her power, that she had never considered negotiation or cooperation. They had treated my cabin as if it existed in a vacuum, ignoring the reality that their rules only matter where law and ownership allow. The tension was palpable. A crowd had begun to gather quietly at a distance, neighbors curious, watching, listening, and filming. Every frustrated glance, every muttered complaint, every gesture of the HOA leaders reinforced the imbalance. The power was no longer theirs. It was mine, measured, deliberate, undeniable. The first confrontation ended without violence, without chaos, but with a clear shift. The HOA had assumed control, only to find themselves at the mercy of facts, legality, and comm strategy. I had demonstrated that patience, preparation, and subtle intelligence were far more effective than anger, intimidation, or assumption. By midday, the message had spread quietly through the neighborhood. People who had once feared the HOA now whispered about the power of knowledge and patience. The road, the cabin, and the sealed gate had become more than a minor dispute. They were a symbol of strategy, of calm, intelligent resistance, and of the moment when arrogance met reality. And as I returned inside, closing the door behind me, a smile tugged at my lips. The confrontation had begun, but the story was far from over. They would make moves, they would escalate, and each step would reveal more about their assumptions and limitations. But I was ready. Every measure I had taken, every plan I had devised, was about to come into play in a way that would not only protect my property but also transform the dynamic of the entire neighborhood. Because sometimes the quietest, most calculated moves deliver the loudest, most unforgettable impact. And in the case of the sealed gate, the unsuspecting HOA was about to learn that lesson in a way they would never forget. The days following the initial confrontation were a study in tension, patience, and quiet anticipation. The HOA, humiliated but unwilling to admit defeat, began plotting their next move. I watched from the cabin, sipping coffee in the early mornings, observing every subtle motion, theirs and the neighborhood's. It was a chess game, but unlike most chess games, this one had an audience, witnesses who were increasingly aware of the HOA's arrogance and the fragility of their assumed control. By midweek, Karen and her entourage returned. This time, it wasn't just Jeff. There were multiple HOA members, all moving with a forced air of confidence, as if sheer numbers could counteract the reality of the law, the documents, and the plan that I had quietly constructed. They approached the sealed gate, clipboards in hand, their voices carrying rehearsed indignation, but I noticed a subtle hesitation in Karen's eyes, the first sign that she realized she was outmatched. I stepped outside again, calm, unhurried, letting the winter air fill my lungs, letting the frostbitten silence speak louder than any words. "Morning, everyone," I said warmly, as if we were neighbors discussing nothing more complicated than the weather. "I trust you've all had a chance to review the property documents I shared last week." The collective pause that followed was telling. None of them could openly deny the evidence. Their strategy, built on assumptions and intimidation, had collided headfirst with reality. Karen opened her mouth to speak, faltering slightly, then faltering more when I added, casually, "If you need continued access for the community, we can discuss it, but it must respect property rights and legal agreements. Anything else could be considered trespassing." Her expression twisted in frustration. It was obvious she had not anticipated the consequences of her previous actions. The sealed gate had been intended as a display of authority, a power move. Instead, it had become a leverage point. The irony was delicious, almost poetic. Meanwhile, the neighborhood watched silently from windows, driveways, and even parked cars at a distance. Cameras subtly raised, phones recording. The story had shifted from a simple property dispute to a public spectacle, a test of patience and strategy versus arrogance and assumptions. Every gesture the HOA made, every frustrated glance exchanged, was amplified by these witnesses, turning the microcosm of my cabin into a stage of quiet drama. By late morning, it became clear that the HOA had no immediate solution. They couldn't open the gate without consent, and they couldn't ignore the legal ramifications if they did. Their murmured debates, intended to reassure themselves of power, only highlighted their lack of options. And I remained calm, deliberate, patient. Every move I had made was calculated, every interaction designed to escalate tension without provoking unnecessary conflict, ensuring the legal high ground remained firmly on my side. It was during this tension-filled lull that the first ripple of my strategic plan began to take effect. I had quietly prepared a solution that would demonstrate both cleverness and resilience. Beneath the unassuming gate, I had reinforced the ground with a hidden support, an immovable barrier disguised under snow, dirt, and subtle landscaping. Nothing violent, nothing aggressive, simply a prepared obstacle that would shift the HOA's next move from confidence to chaos. Karen, unaware of this subtle reinforcement, decided to assert herself. With a pointed gesture and a tone that had, until now, commanded compliance, she insisted on opening the gate immediately. "We need to get through," she demanded, voice tight with frustration. "This is unacceptable. Access is blocked, and I won't allow it." I smiled faintly. "I understand your urgency, Karen, but as you can see, any attempt to force access without consent isn't just risky, it's legally problematic." Her smirk faltered, replaced by that telltale flash of doubt. She moved closer, hand on the gate, attempting to test it physically. And that's when it happened. The reinforced barrier beneath the gate resisted her effort. Not violently, not dangerously, but effectively. The gate would not budge, and the resistance was undeniable. Her surprise was immediate, her posture stiffening. The HOA members around her froze, exchanging quick, confused glances. This was not part of their plan. They had assumed the gate was simply a physical barrier they could remove at will, ignoring ownership, ignoring preparation, ignoring strategy. And now their arrogance met a wall, literally. I remained calm, speaking softly but clearly. "I anticipated that, Karen. That's why I suggested a collaborative solution last week. It's not too late to approach this rationally, but any attempt to bypass my property or compromise my legal rights will be documented and addressed accordingly." The tension was almost tangible in the cold air. Karen, red-faced, muttering under her breath, realized for the first time that her power was illusory. The gate, simple and unassuming, had become a symbol of resistance, strategy, and the consequences of underestimating someone who had prepared patiently. The neighbors, now fully aware of the unfolding drama, whispered among themselves. Some smiled in quiet satisfaction, others filmed discreetly, ensuring that every frustrated gesture, every awkward pause, every faltering attempt at authority was recorded. Public perception had begun to sway decisively. Karen, who had thrived on intimidation and assumption, was now exposed not just to me, but to the collective eyes of the community. By afternoon, attempts at negotiation began. Karen and the HOA members, realizing brute force would not work, tried to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding. They suggested temporary measures, proposed formal meetings, and attempted to assert procedural correctness. I listened patiently, acknowledging each proposal, but maintained firm boundaries. I'm happy to discuss legal, collaborative solutions, I said calmly. But any action outside these parameters cannot be tolerated. And here's the brilliance of the strategy. Patience had allowed me to control the narrative. The HOA, despite their numbers and prior confidence, was now operating defensively. Each proposal, each demand, each assertion of authority was subtly undermined by their lack of preparation and my quiet dominance of the facts. By late afternoon, Karen's frustration became almost palpable. She had underestimated the combination of patience, strategy, and subtle preparation. Every step she took to assert control backfired quietly, systematically. The reinforced gate stood as a testament to cleverness, to foresight, and to the quiet power of understanding both law and human behavior. The day ended without a dramatic confrontation, but with a decisive shift. Karen and the HOA realized that their assumptions, their intimidation, and their insistence on control were irrelevant against preparation, patience, and legal authority. And the neighborhood, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, had begun to take note. There was a new balance of power, one rooted in intelligence, calm, and strategy, not in bluster or authority. As I returned inside my cabin, the sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted land, I felt a quiet thrill. The stage was set for the final act, the moment when the consequences of arrogance would collide with preparation and foresight in a way no one would forget. And I knew with certainty that the story was about to reach its climax, where cleverness and patience would achieve what anger and authority never could. The morning arrived crisp, clear, and calm, almost deceptively so. I stood at the edge of my driveway, coffee in hand, watching the sun glint off the snow, glint off the reinforced gate that had become the silent centerpiece of the unfolding saga. Karen, predictably, appeared shortly thereafter, driving her usual oversized SUV, perfectly coiffed hair untouched by the wind, sunglasses glinting as if daring the world to challenge her authority. But this time, there was a subtle hesitation in her movements, a slight narrowing of her eyes, an almost imperceptible doubt that told me she knew, deep down, that her assumptions might no longer hold true. As she parked near the sealed gate, I noticed the other HOA members stepping out as well, clipboard hands trembling slightly, whispers exchanged quickly, almost conspiratorially. Their usual confidence had dissolved, replaced with tension, uncertainty, and a creeping recognition that the narrative had shifted. The neighborhood, too, was already awake to the drama. Children peeked through frost-covered windows, neighbors lingered near driveways, subtle smiles playing on their lips, all waiting for the next move. Karen approached the gate with a purposeful stride, as if sheer determination could undo the laws of reality. She leaned in, hand on the cold metal, testing, pushing, tugging. Nothing. The reinforced structure beneath the snow resisted perfectly. She furrowed her brow, jaw tightening. She could no longer rely on the illusion of control. The gate had become a monument, a symbol of patience, preparation, and unyielding strategy. I walked toward her, casual, calm, each step deliberate. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice even, friendly, disarmingly calm. "I see you've noticed the gate holds. It's not difficult to understand why, if you're willing to review the documents." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The arrogance that had fueled previous confrontations now wavered. She muttered something under her breath, but the muttering lacked the venom of confidence. It was edged with frustration and uncertainty. For the first time, I saw her hesitation, the realization that authority without understanding is fragile. "Now, Karen," I continued, walking slowly around the gate, "I am more than willing to discuss access, cooperation, and reasonable solutions. But any attempt to bypass my property without consent could have consequences, legal, financial, and reputational." At this moment, the neighborhood collectively held its breath. Children peeking from behind curtains, cameras subtly raised, neighbors whispering in quiet anticipation. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about the collapse of perceived power, the unraveling of arrogance, and the victory of preparation over impulse. Karen's first instinct was to assert dominance. She raised her voice, demanding, "This is ridiculous. I am the HO. You can't block access. This is our road, our community." I interrupted gently, almost conversationally. "Karen, the road in question crosses my land. You may have assumed access, but the legal reality is different. Any action taken against my property without consent is considered trespassing. I'm happy to cooperate, but only on those terms." The tension in the air was tangible. Her smirk had vanished. The familiar posture of authority, the one that once caused neighbors to flinch, was replaced by a mixture of shock, disbelief, and growing panic. She looked around at the watching neighborhood, realizing the audience had shifted. For weeks, she had ruled with fear and assumption. Now, every pair of eyes, every whisper, every camera lens bore witness to her inability to enforce control. The final moment of the climax came swiftly. Karen, perhaps thinking brute force or a dramatic gesture might salvage her pride, attempted to open the gate physically once more, pushing harder, exerting more force. The reinforced structure, unseen yet meticulously prepared, held firm. The SUV behind her seemed to strain, the tires crunching against the icy snow, but the barrier didn't budge. The absurdity of her situation was unmistakable. The woman who had believed herself invincible, untouchable, and in control was thwarted by nothing more than preparation, patience, and foresight. Neighbors began murmuring openly, voices carrying across the snowy street. Some chuckled quietly, others whispered reassurances to each other. And the children, emboldened, giggled from windows and porches. Karen's face shifted through disbelief, anger, and finally, a dawning realization. She had miscalculated. She had underestimated both me and the quiet power of patience and preparation. I leaned slightly on the gate, speaking calmly, yet with undeniable authority. "Karen, this is a reminder that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when combined with arrogance. I'm open to cooperation, but only within the bounds of law and respect. Any further attempts to bypass these boundaries will be documented, and appropriate actions will be taken." It was a soft-spoken declaration, but it carried the weight of inevitability. The narrative had shifted irrevocably. Karen, defeated in her attempt to assert brute authority, realized she was not just confronting a gate. She was confronting the consequences of her own hubris. The neighborhood, witnessing this unraveling, began to sense that the balance of power had changed. By late morning, the HOA members had retreated to consider their next move. Karen lingered a moment longer, muttering, gesturing, pacing, but the energy had shifted. She was no longer the figure of intimidation. She was now the subject of quiet observation, her failures on display. Neighbors, emboldened by the spectacle, subtly documented her retreat, ensuring that every frustrated glance, every muttered threat, every faltering step was recorded. The community, once silent under her reign, had begun reclaiming its voice. Over the next few days, the story unfolded in subtle, yet profound ways. Karen attempted to rally support, sending emails, trying to pressure neighbors, but each move was met with polite but firm refusals. The documentation of her reckless attempts, combined with witnesses' accounts, created a record of accountability that could not be ignored. Her credibility began to crumble under its own weight. Meanwhile, the reinforced gate stood quietly, unassuming but victorious, a symbol of cleverness, preparation, and patient strategy. Children played freely around it, neighbors smiled knowingly, and the atmosphere of fear that had once pervaded the street dissipated like snow melting in the spring sun. The cabin, my property, and the gate had become more than physical entities. They were symbols of resistance, intelligence, and the power of calm, deliberate action. Karen ultimately moved away, unable to reclaim the authority she had assumed was hers by right. The HOA, chastened and wary, adjusted its approach, recognizing that intimidation and assumption could no longer dictate outcomes. The neighborhood, having witnessed the entire saga, had regained a collective sense of agency. understanding that cleverness, preparation, and patience could triumph over aggression and entitlement. As I watched the sun set behind the mountains, casting long golden shadows across the snow-dusted land, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The story, which began with a sealed gate, had evolved into a lesson in strategy, patience, and the quiet power of intelligence. The snow, the gate, the cabin. They all stood as reminders that assumptions are fragile, arrogance is temporary, and preparation can transform potential conflict into undeniable victory. The narrative of that winter would be retold for years. The gate remained intact, a monument to careful planning and quiet triumph. Neighbors, once passive, now spoke freely, laughed openly, and shared the story as both caution and inspiration. Karen's reign of intimidation was over, and the lesson was clear. True power lies not in aggression, authority, or fear, but in patience, foresight, and the unwavering refusal to be intimidated. And as I stepped back into the warmth of my cabin, watching the gentle glow of the sunset reflect off the snow, I realized that victory had not come through confrontation or anger. It had come through cleverness, preparation, and calm resolve. Sometimes the quietest actions, the most unassuming preparations, yield the most spectacular outcomes. The cabin gate, standing firm and unyielding, became a testament to that truth. It wasn't just a gate. It was strategy. It was patience. It was intelligence. It was justice, subtle, unassuming, and utterly effective. And the neighborhood, now alive with laughter and free from fear, would forever remember that winter. The winter when a sealed gate taught a lesson no amount of arrogance could erase.